Welcome to ZBrush. So right now I've got a custom interface set up. So you guys probably, do you have, I think the default, right? So I'll show you guys later on how to do custom interfaces, how to load them. So this is your basic ZBrush. Usually when you start up, you get this sort of menu. So you've got, this is called Lightbox. So if you click on Lightbox, you can kind of close and open it, or you can use the semicolon key. If you look kind of in the bottom left of my screen, you'll see the shortcuts, and that'll be in the video as well, right? So every time I hit that key, it's going to show. So you've got, I guess, about two file types that ZBrush uses. One is the project file. I personally don't use project files hardly at all, practically never. The only advantage to projects, yes. So you've got basically the sort of project browser. So there's a bunch of pre-built stuff in here. Projects are accessed through File, Save As, okay, or File Open. A lot of people make a crucial mistake though, and where they go to File, Document, Save As. It's literally just going to save a screenshot of whatever's there on the document space. ZBrush is a little weird. The window of the 3D software is not some big open void. It's basically like a PSD document, except that the pixels, each pixel in the document have 3 dimensions to them. So it's actually kind of like Z-depth. Has anybody heard of Z-depth before? Maybe, maybe not. So Z-depth is basically an image with a 2D image with depth in it. So if I just switch over here to my window, right? Just close that out. Oh, it's on another screen. Anyways, yeah, so if you have an image, okay, I'll just create an image. And if we have a brush stroke, right, once you zoom in close enough, you'll actually see individual pixels. So the document space is like that inside of ZBrush, but each pixel has depth to it. So it actually measures depth in terms of grayscale, and that's what's known as Z-depth. So I'll just see if I can move these windows over, sorry. So this is Z-depth. Basically, it's a type of shading in a 2D image. So this can be saved as a JPEG, a bitmap, a TIFF, Targa, whatever. And it actually records 3D information based on shading. So the depth or the distance in the scene is recorded as distance. Things closer to the camera are white. Things further away are black. And that's how the ZBrush viewport works. It's basically, it's not a real viewport, it's a document. So if you drag out, let's say this dog, or if I double click the dog project, it's going to open that project, and right away you're in edit mode. So edit mode is great because it allows you to sculpt on the object. But if I turn off edit mode, and if you just drag copies of your brush out, you get a ton of copies, okay? So ZBrush is one of these weird softwares where the document or the 3D workspace is really like a Photoshop document where each pixel, like I said, has that kind of Z-depth or depth to it. And that's why they call it pixel logic. It's P-I-X-O-L, not E-L, because that's the revolutionary technology behind it, is that each pixel has depth. So the last one you drag out, when you go to edit, will be the one that you can live edit and sculpt. So if I hit Control N is basically like going to document and hitting new document. So you do want to make sure whenever you drag out a mesh or import a mesh that you have edit mode on. If it's off, and if you're dragging out copies, that's what's happening. You're not in edit mode, and you need to clear the canvas, okay? So it's a very kind of important first thing to learn about ZBrush. And like I said, if you go to Document Save As, it'll tell you, it actually now thankfully intelligently warns you, do you want to save the document, which is just like a screenshot of what's currently in the viewport, or do you want to save the tool? So like I said, there's really 2 3D file formats that are key, which is the project. Again, the project file format really only adds a few extras in terms of render settings, maybe some lighting settings. But the tool format, which is the one I use the most, it contains really all the information you need. The sculpting, information, the vertex information. It does contain material and some lighting information as well. I find it's a lighter format. Personally, I think it's a little bit better of a format, so that's the one I typically use. So like I said, if you save documents, you do have to go to File, Save, or File, Open. One reason I don't like the documents is that it saves your undo history, and ZBrush has unlimited undos. So you could literally have thousands of actions that are saved in the file, which can make the file size really massive really quickly. You can also turn that option off if you want and go to Preferences and store that. So usually what I do is I do a save as through here, or I'll do a load. So maybe I'll load one of my creepy creatures. So when I go to load something, you know, I can go in and load, yeah, one of these things. And so it's going to bring in, you know, whatever mesh I had. This one didn't have any texture, but I was working on cleaning up the mesh somewhat. Okay. So you can load, you can save as. And as a tip, I often, you know, give my files a certain name and just always number them and version them. Keeps things nice and clean. So it's very useful. Okay, so let's go back to here. So hopefully that explains the difference here between a project and a tool. The project will reset the document size. It'll reset lighting information, rendering settings. If you want to just start sculpting, honestly, one of the easiest ways to do it is to go into one of the Dynamesh spheres. So there's Dynamesh sphere 32, 64, 128, and there's a couple other ones with some other options. So if we just double click, let's say the Dynamesh sphere, I'll say no, I don't want to save changes that I have there, and it's going to load up this sphere. So I'll let you guys double click and load that up. So the main navigation in ZBrush is to rotate around the model, right? So you left click and drag off the model. So if you're using a mouse, it's left click and drag. Ideally, you're using a tablet. So when I say left click and drag, I'll also mean, or interchangeably mean, put your tablet pen down and hold it on the surface and drag it across the surface of the tablet, okay? And you see that in my shortcut as I rotate around, right? So that's like interface option number one. Number two is to actually draw on the surface. If you just left click and drag on the surface, it's no longer rotating, but actually sculpting in a positive or additive way, right? So it's adding some surface shape, right? And you can keep going as long as you can keep the pen down or the mouse down and drag it around. It'll keep going. Number two is, so just to pay attention to this, some brushes are set to be additive, which is called a ZAdd on the little switch here. Some by default are negative, so they may be Z sub, okay? So what's interesting about this is that you can reverse the direction of whether the brush is, if it's an additive or positive brush, you can make it negative. If it's a negative or subtractive brush, you can make it positive. So if I hold Alt, it's now going to dig in to the mesh, to the surface, okay? So that's function number one, holding Alt and then clicking and dragging or dragging your tablet pen across the tablet surface, right? So that's major function, I guess, number two or three. If you want to smooth or average the surfaces out, you can hold Shift and that'll smooth things out, okay? So if you want, you can also undo. Undo is very common amongst most software in Windows. It's Control-Z to undo. So let's say I want to use a bigger smoothing brush. One really common shortcut, S key. Hit the S key, increase the draw size. What's great about that shortcut is it brings the draw size option right to the tip of your mouse or tablet pen. It's basically right here in the upper middle portion of the top toolbar, draw size. So that's one thing that allows you to kind of, you know, smooth maybe a bigger area or lay down a bigger brush stroke, right? Left click and drag. Okay, so there's basically, I would say, three major modifiers to any brush stroke or almost any maneuver you make inside of ZBrush. It's the left mouse button or your tablet pen down, and Alt, Control, or Shift, or a combination. So we've already seen what Alt does. Alt on the model will flip the direction around. Alt off the model will actually move the screen left to right, up and down. So if you Alt, left click and drag off the model, you can kind of move left, right, up and down. And if you just regular Alt click and drag, it'll just rotate. If you need to center or frame your object so it's closer to the camera view, you just hit F, which is just like Maya's short key to frame or fill screen with the object. And let's say you want to get closer or further away. If you hold Alt, then hold left click, then let go of Alt. It's a weird combination, but you let go of Alt but keep your mouse button or your tablet pen down. It actually allows you to zoom in and out. It's going to feel totally weird. It's not going to make sense for probably 2 weeks. But once you get it, especially if you're using your tablet, it's going to make a ton of sense. This is geared towards sculpting with a digital tablet, a pen. And it's really, really great at that. So Alt, left click. So you hold Alt, you hold left click, then you let go of Alt, and you can zoom in and out. We've already covered Shift, so Shift will activate smoothing. And if you take a look in the upper left corner, I'll just show you when I hold Shift, you see it actually switches brushes from a standard to a smooth. If you hold Control, it's going to actually activate a mask pen brush. So there are a couple of mappings that essentially activate a certain category of brush. So Shift activates smoothing brushes. Control activates masking brushes. So if you Control, click, and drag on the model, you get a mask on the model. And again, like I said, it's all combinations of how you click, how you drag, how you hold the button. So if I Control, click off the model, not click and drag, but just left click without moving, Control, hold Control, left click, you can flip the mask around. So you can invert the mask. So I can say I'm going to sculpt this out here, Control click, I'm going to sculpt inwards here to get an extreme change there. And if I want to clear it, I can Control click and drag off the model. That clears the mask. Okay? Now, some other features. If I just show you over here, I'm going to mask a little spot right here. Control click and drag to paint on the surface. By the way, if you Control, click, and drag from off the model, it gives you a rectangular selection. So you can do that one of two ways. Control, click, and drag onto the model to mask in a flatter, sort of squarish way. Control, click, and drag on the model to paint the mask. If you Control tap on the model, it's going to actually blur the mask, so it softens the edge. I'm going to undo a couple times. Control Alt click on the mask will sharpen the mask. So if I blur it and then Control Alt tap and sharpen it, it can sharpen. So again, it's just different types of clicks or drags. So like basically clicking, Control clicking on the model will soften a mask. Control Alt clicking will sharpen a mask. So let's say I Control click on it a couple times to blur it. Control Alt clicking will sharpen. So you can get a very hard edge that way. And then Control, click, and drag off the model to remove. Okay? I don't really know what I'm building, but it's just whatever. Now, one of the final functionalities for an intro that I think is very important is visibility. So if you hold Control Shift, if you notice in the upper left corner, your brush will change to a select, it's called Select Rectangle is the name of the brush. Well, what does that do? Control, click, and drag. You can hide part of the mesh. If you Control, Shift, left click on the visible part, it'll make it invisible and make the opposite part visible. And you can keep going back and forth by Control, Shift. I'm just holding Control and Shift. Left click on that one, left click on this one, and you can go back and forth. If you want to see the whole thing, Control, Shift, left click, anywhere off the model, and the whole thing comes back. Now you can change your brushes. So if you just take a look at the left-hand side, if you click on the brush, it brings up a huge menu of brushes, and you can sort of trim out the categories. So you can say, I want clay brushes, so that would be under C. And there's a bunch of them, different types of brushes. There's clay tubes, clay buildup. These are two that I use a lot. Clay constant. There are clip brushes. There's a lot of kind of types and categories of brushes. I'm not going to get into all of them right now, but you can also alter the stroke of whatever brush you're using. So you can make it a series of dots or more of a solid freehand line. Or you can drag it out. So this is useful when, let's say, you have an alpha or a texture. So let's say if I add an alpha to this standard brush, something like this, and this is Dynamesh, by the way. I'm gonna cover this a bit later on, but I'm gonna Dynamesh this so it's a little bit higher. So I'm gonna smooth it out and then just Dynamesh it. So if I drag this out, you see it's kind of leaving like a copy stamp of it everywhere, but let's say I just want to put single copies of it on the surface. Well, that you just simply go and click on the stroke and switch it from either freehand or dots to something like drag, and you can drag out that stamp or that pattern. If I want more intensity, I would hit the U button on my keyboard, which is the Z intensity, or while you're beginning, you can use the sliders. It's right here, Z intensity. So you drag that out and you get a much more intense part of that stamp or alpha showing up. Okay. Now, in addition to this, let's say I turn this off, you can also drag out or brush out textures. So if I wanted a texture, I can drag out. Right now, there's no color. If you take a look at my brush, it's just set to add. So you can take a standard brush and turn off ZAdd or ZSubtract and turn on RGB. So that now enables color texture functionality, right? And by the way, if you want the full image or full alpha without fading to show up on your stroke, there's something called focal shift. So focal shift is, the shortcut is O on your keyboard. It's almost like the Photoshop hardness softness setting. So you guys hopefully know about that setting, right, in your basic brush. So when the focal shift is basically set to -100, it's a solid texture, a solid alpha. You won't get any fading at the edges. So if I turn this off and switch back to this alpha that I was using, there was some fading on those edges, but now if I drag this out, oops, I have my ZAdd off, so I'm going to click ZAdd and turn it on again. Right, I now get the full sort of impact of that texture without any fading at the edges. So that's another thing to kind of pay attention to, is the focal shift. Okay. So when the focal shift is back to 0, which is its kind of default, you'll get sort of fading on the edges and maybe to more of the interior of that sort of alpha. So those are just some quick ways to kind of modify and brush and manipulate and sculpt your object. And we can also, of course, if we click on material, you can switch the material type. When you're laying down any sort of color, I generally recommend you switch your material to skin shade, skin shade 4, which is right here. Or in some cases too, I'll even use flat color. But in this case, you won't see any sort of surface detail. It'll be very, very flat. But this will show you a better representation of how the color will appear on material that doesn't have any added color to it. These other materials that have some sort of tint or hue added to them will kind of multiply that into the texture. So